The Voices of Texas is a liberal arts council podcast at the University of Texas founded to address social issues. Today, we discuss the campus-wide effort to rename Painter Hall, an example of racist symbolism. Why does this change matter, and how can you contribute? Stick around to find out.
Hello, and welcome to the Voices of Texas podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Cudler. I'm here with Angelina B. and Muzarat. And I'd also like to introduce our guest speaker, who has 2 PhDs, focuses on research of bioethics, social and political theory, and teaches a course on constitutional law at UT Austin undergrad. Thanks for being with us today, Professor Gregg.
Thank you for having me. Today,
we're going to be discussing the issue with Painter Hall's name. Now, Painter Hall is a building at UT that's named after a former UT president, T.S. Painter, who blocked an African-American, Heman Sweat, from attending UT Law School on the sole basis of race. And this culminated in the Supreme Court case Sweat v. Painter. Now, despite T.S. Painter's actions, UT has done little to nothing to change the name. Only the entrance of the building has been renamed after Heman Sweat. The building itself is still called Painter Hall. Bottom line, the name Painter Hall glorifies the racist actions of not only T.S. Painter, but UT as an institution, and should instead be renamed Sweat Hall. But first, who is Heman Sweat and who is T.S. Painter?
In 1946, Heman Sweat was an African-American man who applied to the University of Texas School of Law, but was denied admission purely because of his race. While he had already received a degree from Wiley College and was told by the president of the University of Texas that his credentials were sufficient, he was still not admitted as the university was restricted to whites only under state law.
On the other hand, Theophilus Painter was white and president of UT from 1946 until 1952. He had a degree from Roanoke College and Yale. During his time as the acting president of UT, he refused the admission of Heman Sweat to UT's law school.
So now, before this case arrived at the Supreme Court, Sweat sued UT through many state courts to order his admission. And in response, the University of Texas tried to create a separate law school for Black law students. And then this case finally appeared before the Supreme Court in 1950.
When Sweat was refused admission to the law school of the University of Texas, the state of Texas created in 6 months a law school for African Americans. Consider some of the differences between UT Law and this other law school. UT Law at the time had 16 full-time and 3 part-time professors. The Black law school, only 5. UT Law had 850 students. Black law students, the Black law school, 23. UT Law had a law library with over 650,000 volumes. The Black law school, only 16,500. UT Law had many graduates in public and in private law practice, very helpful for lawyers to network and get jobs and so forth. The Black law school, by contrast, had only 1 graduate admitted to the Texas bar. And the Supreme Court rejected this device of the state of Texas in creating a school. What the state was doing, in fact, was an interpretation of an earlier case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which was decided in 1896 in the state of Louisiana. In that case, the majority held that the 14th Amendment, properly interpreted, allows for the segregation of Black and white. This is the doctrine known as separate but equal. The question arises from how best to read the 14th Amendment, which was adopted in 1868, only 3 years after the Civil War. The Equal Protection Clause states that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, the question is, how to understand the word equal, legally equal. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 says, as long as the facilities are equal, then separate is equal. And I think this is what the state court was attempting to do in Texas in this case. But in fact, the Supreme Court rejected this because while the idea of separate but equal is not illogical on its face, in the specific circumstances of the United States of America, separate is never equal.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court this time issued a 9-0 decision in favor of Sweat. Now, Supreme Court decisions typically end 5-4, 6-3. So when it's a 9-0 decision, it has much, much more weight.
What this case holds is that the use of race as a criterion for the distribution of seats in public law schools in the United States violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because separate facilities in legal education are in fact inherently unequal. As a matter of fact, I should note, incidentally, that this case of 1950 anticipates another case called Brown v. Board, decided only 4 years later. The difference is that Brown v. Board says that race cannot be used as a criterion for the distribution of classroom seats in any public school. And in fact, Brown even says, and this is against the state of Texas as it attempted to address Painter's rejection from UT Law, Brown v. Board Court says that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional, even if the segregated schools are otherwise equal in quality. Even if.
And most importantly, this is such a pivotal case at UT. Even though it occurred in 1950, it eventually paved the way for the full integration of UT in 1956. Because prior to that, Black students had been barred from going to UT under state law. And Professor Gregg, it's interesting how you bring up Plessy v. Ferguson. Because the first question I'd like to address is the name Painter Hall a problem, or are we just manufacturing this, or supposedly looking at it the wrong way and projecting the idea that racism is on it?
Names are important. And the name of a building on a university campus is an honor. The point is to honor the person. And at a university campus, that honor is somehow to reflect upon the institution. And therefore, to name a building on a university campus after a man who pursued the racist agenda that we now know as Jim Crow is to honor the dishonorable. And that reflects poorly on our university.
So now, Angelina Muzarat, do you believe that the name fundamentally needs to change?
I think that, yes, the name of the building has to be changed. Like we've said before, the name is problematic. Honoring someone who is not worthy of honor is not something that should be done. It's not like the University of Texas hasn't changed the names of buildings before. This past summer, after George Floyd was brutally murdered on the 25th of May, the protests across the country also made changes at the University of Texas as well. Students pushed for the renaming of the RLM building, which was named after Robert Lee Moore, a mathematics professor at UT. He was not known for his scholarship, but rather for his racist treatment of African-American students. Students voiced their concerns. The university responded. The RLM building is now called the PMA because students wanted to have their voice heard, and their voice was heard. In 2017, the university removed the statue of Robert E. Lee from the South Mall. So it is absolutely possible for the university to change the name of this building if they decide to do so.
Now I'd like to bring up, because in the issue back in 2015, 2016 with Confederate statues was the fact of this argument, sort of heritage versus hate. And it's like, they don't see Confederate statues as, hate, but rather, it's a part of Southern heritage. And so do you believe this? Do you think that it is inherently wrong? And how can Confederate statues have sort of a similarity to the monuments at UT? Because UT was built in 1883 in the heart of Jim Crow.
I think I would approach that question by understanding that when you have symbols that represent heritage, we have to understand what heritage that's representing. In this case, with the Robert E. Lee statue, we have to understand that he was a Confederate. What exactly was his heritage? What is his legacy? Unfortunately, that legacy is fighting in support of protecting slavery in the United States. And, I think now we're at a point where we recognize that this is our greatest shame. But it's really disheartening when we hear that people would rather turn this into a historical or heritage issue rather than addressing that the moral implications of these statues or even institutions or landmarks are extremely detrimental to the people who have to witness these landmarks. So for example, with this building, you have to imagine the students who go to classes in these buildings. Do they feel inspired to even go in? What are the other implications of having these institutions uphold and glorify these names in history when they are known for their, I guess you can say, their wrongs, their impact that they had on the students before them. When we talk about even the RLM building, which is now the PMA, like Angelina brought up, he wasn't known or remembered anymore for his scholarship. He's remembered for being anti-Semitic, racist, and misogynistic. So what is the university's responsibility? Well, I think that's quite obvious. Our responsibility is to listen to the students and make sure that this is a safe space for all students to really, I guess, harness the best to their ability to uphold this moral upstanding, to making sure that it's a comfortable environment for everybody that goes to this university. Hearing both sides, so not just protecting this sort of quote unquote heritage, but also understanding the moral implications that this has.
I'd like to add something to that.
Sure, hop in.
A university is a space in society that pursues truth. And here we're talking about historical truth. And the statues that you referred to on the South Mall were actually part of a movement following the Civil War, several decades after it, to reclaim or to change the narrative. The Civil War was fought about three things. First, slavery. Second, slavery. And third, slavery. And after the war, the effort to change the narrative to Southern heritage is a dishonest misrepresentation of history. And the perpetuation of systematic, distorted history is unacceptable, surely, if at any place on a university campus. We must always study and think about our troubled American history, but we should never celebrate behavior and beliefs and practices that we now hold to be morally reprehensible.
So now when we change the names of buildings, such as in the case of the RLM to the PMA, is that erasing history? Is there any way to preserve it? Do you believe it is an erasure of history? Is this a fundamentally good thing? Is it nuanced?
Because you change the name of a history or remove a statue does not mean that you refuse to discuss those statues and refuse to discuss those names. It seems to me that, for example, any building whose name has been changed should have a plaque prominently affixed to the entrance explaining that name change. And any statue removed, I think also there should be a plaque explaining what was formerly there and why it was removed.
Angelina, would you like to add on to that?
Yes, please. So there is a very, very large difference between acknowledging history and venerating it. When you remove the name of a person that is not worthy of respect of a building, you are not erasing history. You are refusing to glorify a known racist and making a statement against racial injustice. In Germany, there are no statues or buildings named after Adolf Hitler or any other officials in the Nazi Party, yet they still remember the horrors that occurred in the Second World War. They do not forget because they make it a point to acknowledge the bad parts of their past to work towards a better future. A simple plaque in front of the building talking about Painter's legacy, what he did, and why he was problematic enough to have his name removed from said building would suffice.
Now, Professor Gregg, I understand you have studied in Germany, so I presume you've lived there as well. So can we equate statues of Nazis to our Confederate legacy? Like, I understand Germany wholeheartedly understands that, yes, they had a history of Nazism and do the best they can to make sure it never happens again. So can we equate Germany's history of Nazism to America's, the Confederacy's, and UT's history of Jim Crow and segregation?
Histories are in some ways comparable, but are always unique. What we Americans can learn from the German example is that one can deal with a difficult history, not by erasing it, but not by celebrating it. That's why, for example, there are no statues to Hitler and Goebbels and the other leaders of the Nazis. There are no streets, no longer named. During the Third Reich, of course, many plazas and many streets were named after these people. In Germany today, there are other ways to remember this difficult history. For example, there are many streets in Germany that have cobblestones, small cobblestones, maybe 2 inches by 2 inches. And there's a movement to put on the top of these, some of these stones, a copper plate in front of those houses where we have information that Jews were removed during the Third Reich. And if we know if they were murdered, where they were murdered, and when. And so an everyday activity, such as walking down the street, allows you to deal with the Third Reich across that Germany will always have to bear, in no way celebrating this past and providing no opportunity for neo-Nazis to celebrate that past. And in the same way, we here in America, certainly at the University of Texas at Austin, need to prevent any way in which white nationalists, chauvinists, racists could find a statue or a name or a building that they could use to venerate their repugnant views that deny the equality of all citizens.
So now I want to raise this question. Should we even idolize people of history in the first place? Because, supposedly as times move on, that figures from the past will always be viewed with a viewpoint of modern day ethics. And thus everyone over time will eventually become problematic. So should we name buildings and statues after people?
I think what's interesting in this idea is as society progresses and as we learn more about the people that we quote unquote idolize, we learn more about their history and who they were as people versus what was, publicized about them initially. I think it's great that now we're at a point where we're able to take figures that might have been popular to us and we're able to point out the faults that they may have in order to learn and take lessons from that. But I think overall, what we should be doing is understanding, weighing their rights and their wrongs. If we venerate or if we uphold someone because we appreciate their stance on certain civil rights issues, but they have also said things that are racist or misogynistic or things that we consider unethical and not to our moral standing, I think it's our responsibility to speak honestly and truthfully about the people that we may idolize in order to make the best decision. We shouldn't be too quick on who we idolize and which figures in history we choose. But I think the important thing is that we're forever in this cycle of learning and growing and upholding this moral compass that helps our society become better as people.
If we insist that people who might inspire us be angels, we would have no one. And a more plausible and fruitful path is to appreciate the contributions while being mindful of the failings. Indeed, one might look at the United States Constitution in this very way. This is a document which in 1787, after all, includes, among other sections, in Article 1, Section 2, the statement that any person who was not free would be counted as 3/5 of a free individual for the purposes of determining the number of states representatives in the House of Representatives. Those are slaves. The Constitution of 1787 constitutionalizes slavery. But that's not the whole Constitution. The Constitution, in many of its parts, is attempting to create equal citizens and to provide for the dignity of each person. And one might argue that that 3/5 clause ultimately is a kind of foreign body for the overall intention of the Constitution, and that the Constitution is strong enough to allow us to identify those extraneous bodies and to reject them, and to perfect the vision of the Constitution is never to deny the role of the Constitution, for example, in slavery, but also to appreciate that the Constitution does not condemn us to slavery. That kind of thoughtful, nuanced approach could also be taken to people who we admire in part, even as we appreciate their failings.
Okay, so it's good we're coming away with a nuanced version of history. But now let me ask you this. T.S. Painter was just a man. Is there any nuance to him himself or to his racism or to the actions he did? Because he was a prominent zoologist. On the other hand, he also barred a black man from entering UC Law School on the sole basis of race. And yes, he may have been adhering to state law, but nonetheless, he was compliant in according to that state law.
There are times in which rules are meant to be broken. The United States itself was founded by revolting founding fathers who decided they had had enough of the rules they were given. Every meaningful change that has ever happened in our society or in our history has happened because people decided that they were not going to listen to the rules because they realized that these rules were not in their self-interest. This man did listen to state law. He did a very horrible thing by listening to state law, and one's moral compass would have, in a better world, had pushed him to not deny admission to Mr. Sweat based on his race. I think that sometimes you just have to put the rules on the back burner and you have to do what you know is right in your own soul.
One could also say that, in fact, Painter was upholding the Plessy versus Ferguson formula that the 14th Amendment's equal protection clause can be understood as separate but equal. But I would argue that that understanding is fraudulent and that everybody always knew it. One would always observe in the United States of America that separate was always unequal, especially when it comes to African Americans. And therefore that as university president in 1950, Mr. Painter was guilty of enforcing an obviously fraudulent understanding of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which was incidentally written and adopted in 1868 precisely because the authors knew that Black men, women, and children would not be treated as equal citizens, especially in the southern states. In other words, the 14th Amendment was designed to prevent exactly what Theophilus Painter did in 1950.
So now I'd like to bring up a difference in legacy between T.S. Painter and Lincoln, because I think it really, really sets them apart. Now, Lincoln and Painter, of course, they had their faults. They're just men. But Lincoln ultimately made the move to abolish slavery when the majority of Americans in the North, and most certainly those in the Confederacy, were not on board with the idea. Whereas Painter actively upheld the philosophies of the Jim Crow South on the doorstep of the civil rights movement. This was 1950. That is not a long time ago. That is the age of Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn Monroe, and Joe McCarthy, and Albert Einstein. That is very, very recent, all too recent for comfort. And Painter could have chosen to take a bold step and allowed Sweat to attend UT Law. He would be violating the state law in the process, but he would be doing what is morally right. Instead, Painter chose to uphold the principles of Jim Crow and block Sweat because of his race alone, despite his qualifications. The bottom line is, both men made a choice. Lincoln chose to move towards a more righteous America, and the other, T.S. Painter, sat content, refused, and actively dug his heels in, fighting until the case rose to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court had to step in and say, no, this is inherently unequal. It violates the 14th Amendment because you were discriminating solely on the basis of race.
And you can stand at Painter Hall and see the tower. And on one of the four sides of the tower is an inscription from the Bible. It says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And the truth, in 1950 as now, is that there is no rational relationship between the color of a person's skin and their capacity to do well and profit from an education and to compete with anyone else. And what Painter did in 1950, in a certain sense, was also to deny this inscription on the UT Tower.
So I guess my final question is, what is Painter's legacy and how does that still affect us today? Angelina Muzaron?
I would say that Painter's legacy is that by having a building named after him, I think we are misappropriately revering his role at UT, and we just sort of gloss over this aspect of, like you mentioned, how he fought in order to bar this African-American man's admission to the UT Law School. And instead, UT is more so glorifying his role as served as the sitting president during one portion of its time. So I think now we're at a day and age where we're able to talk about his legacy in a more honest light and discussing how the Supreme Court case was instrumental in the civil rights movement. I think more people should be aware of this. More students at UT should be aware of this. And by having this discussion, I think we're able to honestly and open-endedly talking about his legacy in the light that it should be spoken about, which is in regards to his racist past and his contribution to barring African-American admission to the University of Texas and how this is detrimental as a whole. By not doing so, it's dishonest, unethical, and I think it's setting us behind.
So I am a freshman at the University of Texas, and I was not aware of the problematicness of a former university president until I showed up on campus and was finally told about the etymology of the name of Painter Hall. And all I could think of on the day where I finally learned about this man was, how do African-American Longhorns feel walking into this building? And I think that the university is not doing its African-American population any good when they venerate a man with such problematic history on one of their buildings. As Professor Gregg said, it is an honor and a privilege to have a building named after you, and a man who fought and fought and fought to have a Black man denied admission from UT Law because he was not the color that he wanted. That is not a man worth naming a building after.
So this issue about Painter Hall is a mere microcosm of the larger issue of race relations in America. The deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor not only sparked protests against police brutality, but also led to a renewed analysis of race relations in America. Now, renaming Painter Hall will not solve all of America's or UT's problems regarding race, but it is a start.
The next section that's important to talk about is what do we do? We have all this information, and I think it's important that we've seen this happen before where students are able to voice their opinion. Why can't we do it again? Well, the good news is there's some talks of doing this, but what we've heard so far is that UT has been able to rename the entryway. But what we want to address is this isn't enough. Simply renaming an entryway does not do justice to the history of this building, to the history of the case as a whole, and does nothing towards, I guess, getting justice for Sweat, who is part of the Supreme Court case. I think what's important to address is there's no nuance to racism, and we have a moral obligation to concede nothing to it. Potential rejections to this may be that removing physical symbols of oppression does not effectively combat racism. However, we don't find it to warrant any sense of community. In order to understand why it's not enough to merely rename buildings or remove statues of known racists, one must believe in the principles of the university. That is to unite, educate, and foster goodwill.
In June of this year, a proposal was sent to the University of Texas administration calling for better diversity representation on campus, including the renaming of UT buildings that were named after Confederate veterans, former slave owners, and other figures of the university's racist past. Over 13,000 Texas students, alumni, and faculty signed a proposal called the 8 Demands, and it was submitted by students on June 9th, 2020.
And this was not an empty proposal. UT's Board of Regents and the sitting president actually went and changed the name of the RLM to the PMA because it was originally named after Robert Lee Moore, who, yes, was a mathematics professor at UT, but was also a known segregationist, anti-Semite, and misogynist. And after the students expressed their concerns, with having a building named after such a vicious figure of UT history, the university listened. And RLM swiftly became the PMA, Physics, Math, and Astronomy building, and demonstrating how a collective call to action can bring about change. And so now we sit here with Painter Hall, still named Painter Hall, despite T.S. Painter's legacy. And we propose it should be renamed Sweat Hall. Now, yes, the university has renamed the entrance after Heman Sweat, but it has inadvertently not changed anything, really. The large majority of the building is still named after Painter, while a sliver is named after Sweat. If anything, it still instills a sort of faux white supremacy attitude, as the majority is still named after Painter, while Sweat, an African-American man, gets this tiny little piece. If anything, it is poetic justice to rename the entire building Sweat, or perhaps even flip it, naming the entrance after Painter and putting up a plaque demonstrating why the name was changed and why T.S. Painter has such a problematic history, why the building is named after Sweat. And of course, we don't have to name it after Heman Sweat. There's millions of other people we could choose from. Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Thurgood Marshall, Cesar Chavez, etc.
The University of Texas's motto is, "What starts here changes the world." At a university that seeks to inspire change on a global scale, we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and change our wrongs. About 5% of students on campus are African American, and these monuments of glorified white supremacy on our campus, on their footsteps, are insensitive and antiquated. UT may be technologically expanding at a rapid rate, but we are falling behind in addressing our racist history, which serves as a painful reminder of segregation, oppression, and the legacy of Jim Crow.
If you agree that Painter Hall should be renamed, you can do 2 things. First, you can sign this change.org petition link, which you can also find in the bio of the UT Liberal Arts Council Instagram page, UTLA Council. Second, you can take this email template and send it to Dr. Hartzell to let him know that the students of UT support renaming Painter Hall. You can also find the template on our Instagram page in the bio.
Now we know this is a tough discussion and not an easy discussion to have, but we have to talk about it. Now, once again, renaming Painter Hall to Sweat Hall will not solve all of our racial problems, but it's a start towards a better UT that wholeheartedly condemns the legacy of Jim Crow, segregation, and oppression that it sadly once took a part of. It is a long overdue decision And it is the responsibility of the university to end its public commemoration of white supremacy that has pained African American students on campus. Now, for our closing note, I'll leave you with a quote from Thurgood Marshall, who not only argued in Brown v. Board, but was also the first Black Supreme Court justice. Where you see wrong or inequality or injustice, speak out, because this is your country. This is your democracy. Make it, protect it, pass it on. All right, that seems like a good place to leave it. Thank you, Angelina. Thank you, Muzarat. And a big thanks to Professor Greg for coming on to our podcast. My name is Joseph Cudler, and this was the first episode of the Voices of Texas podcast. Be sure to tune in next week when we discuss the eyes of Texas.